Hey guys, welcome back to more legal advice stories. Imagine your pregnant wife is dying, the ambulance is coming, but your neighbor deliberately parks across your driveway to teach you a lesson about parking disputes. He refused to move and watched her suffer, but what happened next? This man's obsession with property lines just earned him a lesson he would never forget. And the title Legal Advice Reddit story starts like this. So I'm still shaking as I write this and I honestly don't even know where to start. So I need legal advice desperately because I'm about to lose my mind over what happened yesterday morning. Some background first, my wife and I have lived in our house for about 3 years now. We are in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone mostly keeps to themselves. Our next door neighbor, let's call him Bob, moved in about 8 months ago. From day one he has been a nightmare. The guy is retired, has nothing but time on his hands and seems to dedicate every waking hour to making everyone around him miserable. The issues started small. He would complain about our garbage bins being 6 inches over the property line. He would measure the height of our grass with a ruler and leave passive-aggressive notes if it was a 1/4 inch too long according to some interpretation of HOA rules that did not actually exist. He called code enforcement on us twice because our garden hose was visible from the street. Both times they came out, looked around and basically told us that he was wasting their time. And yes, that was Disney screaming in the background. The guy is obsessed with rules and property values and neighborhood standards. About 2 months ago, things escalated. So we got a single driveway that runs along the property line between our houses. Technically, about 2 feet of it is on our property, but the rest is right up against the line. There's a narrow strip of grass between our driveway and his property, and Bob became convinced that we were encroaching on his property when we parked. He would come out with a tape measure and take photos if our car's mirror was over the line by even an inch. He sent us a certified letter demanding we stop trespassing on his property with our vehicles. I tried to be reasonable. I showed him the survey. I showed him the property line markers. I even offered to pay for a professional survey if he wanted one. He refused everything and just kept insisting that we were violating his rights. He started leaving traffic cones along the property line, so we would have to park perfectly centered in our driveway or risk hitting them. It was insane, but I figured I would just deal with it and avoid the guy. Then yesterday happened. So yesterday morning, around 6:30 a.m., my wife woke me up. She was having severe abdominal pain and could barely breathe. She is 5 months pregnant with our first child, and she was crying and telling me that something was really wrong. I've never seen her like that. She is the toughest person I know and she was terrified. I immediately called 911 while helping her get dressed. The dispatcher told me an ambulance was on the way and to get her outside if possible. I helped her down the stairs and opened the front door to get her to the car in case the ambulance took too long. That is when I saw it. Bob had parked his truck directly across our driveway, not partially blocking it, completely blocking it. His truck was perpendicular to the driveway, blocking both our cars and the garage. I ran outside and the truck was empty. I looked over and Bob was standing on his porch with his arms crossed, just watching. I yelled at him to move his truck. My wife was leaning against the doorframe, crying in pain, and he just stared at me and said, "Maybe this will teach you to respect property boundaries." I completely lost it here. I screamed that my wife was having a medical emergency and I needed to get her to the hospital. He just shook his head and said, "Should have thought about that before parking over my property line all these months. Actions have consequences." I couldn't believe what I was hearing here. I ran back inside and told the 911 dispatcher what was happening. She stayed on the line and said that she was noting everything and that the ambulance was 3 minutes away. However, my wife was getting worse. She collapsed in the doorway and I had to catch her. She was going pale and her breathing was shallow. I ran back out and begged Bob to move his truck. I was literally begging this man, telling him that my wife might be dying. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Not my problem. Maybe call a tow truck." So I did. I called the non-emergency police line while still on with 911 on my other phone, and I explained the situation and they said they would send an officer. But my wife was in bad shape and I was panicking. I could hear the ambulance sirens in the distance, but they couldn't get down our street because there was not enough room to get around Bob's truck. The ambulance had to park at the end of the street. The paramedics had to run down with their equipment. Those extra 4 or 5 minutes felt like hours. They got to my wife and immediately started working on her. They said her blood pressure was dangerously low and they suspected a placental abruption. They needed to get her to the hospital immediately. Here is where it gets even worse though. The paramedics couldn't get their stretcher back to the ambulance easily because Bob's truck was blocking the path. They had to carry my wife in the stair chair down the street to the ambulance. She was fading in and out of consciousness. Every second counted. A police officer showed up right as they were loading my wife into the ambulance. I quickly explained what happened, pointed at Bob's truck, pointed at Bob standing on his porch, still watching everything with his smug expression. The officer went over to talk to him, and I heard Bob say something about property rights and teaching lessons. The officer came back to me and said that he was calling for a tow truck immediately and that Bob would be cited for what he did. He told me to go with my wife and that he would handle everything. I jumped in the ambulance and we rushed to the hospital. The next several hours were a complete blur. The doctors said that my wife had a partial placental abruption and that if she had gotten to the hospital even 10 minutes later, we could have lost both her and the baby. They did an emergency procedure and managed to stabilize everything. My wife and baby are okay now, but she is on strict bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy, and the doctors said it is still high risk. I found out later that Bob's truck was towed, of course. He was cited for blocking a driveway and for obstruction, but that's it, some tickets. Meanwhile, my wife almost died. My unborn child almost died because this man wanted to teach me a lesson about parking. I'm sitting in the hospital room right now while my wife is sleeping. I cannot stop thinking about those minutes where the ambulance couldn't get to her, where the paramedics had to run down the street, where they had to carry her because they couldn't get the stretcher through. Seriously, those minutes that could have killed her and our baby. What legal recourse do I have here? Can I press charges? Can I sue him? The police said that he got tickets, but that seems like nothing compared to what he did. I got the 911 recording, I have the paramedics report, I have the police report, I have hospital records showing how serious my wife's condition was. I need to know what I can do here. This man nearly killed my family because he was mad about parking. What are my options here? And yeah guys, if you would have been in this situation, what would you have done and what would you advise OP to do? Obviously, this neighbor was absolutely ridiculous and he deserves some legal consequences for this, if you ask me. Also, if you still enjoy the old school legal advice stories, then please don't forget to like the video because it would help me tremendously if we could reach 1000 likes. Anyway, comment number 1 here, lawyer here, though not your lawyer. This is way beyond small claims territory. What your neighbor did could constitute reckless endangerment because he knowingly blocked emergency access during a medical crisis. Number 2, possible assault charges depending on your jurisdiction. Number 3, potential basis for a civil lawsuit for emotional distress, medical expenses and punitive damages. Contact a personal injury attorney immediately. Many work on contingency, so you won't pay unless you win. Your neighbor's actions directly endangered your wife's life and your unborn kid's life, and the fact that he did this knowingly and intentionally is gonna work heavily in your favor. Also, contact the district attorney's office about pressing criminal charges. What he did was not just a civil matter. Deliberately blocking emergency access during a life-threatening medical emergency could be criminal. You may also want to file a restraining order. This man has shown that he's willing to risk lives to make a point. I'm sorry you're going through this, but focus on your wife and baby's health first and absolutely pursue this legally. This is one of the most egregious cases I've heard of. Comment number 2, former paramedic here, those extra minutes matter a lot. In cases of placental abruption, every second counts. Also, make sure you get a copy of the EMS report. It should detail everything, including the obstruction, the delay in accessing the patient, and the severity of her condition. Paramedics will document exactly what happened, and that documentation is gold in court. Comment number 3, real estate attorney here. I saw you mention that he's been harassing you about property lines. Well, get a professional survey done ASAP if you haven't already. Document all the previous harassment. This pattern of behavior matters. If he's been making false claims about property boundaries and using those false claims to justify harassment, that strengthens your case significantly. It shows premeditation and malicious intent. Also, check your local ordinances about driveway obstruction. In many jurisdictions, intentionally blocking someone's driveway is actually a more serious offense than just a parking violation, especially if it interferes with emergency services. You need a lawyer who handles both personal injury and civil rights cases. Your neighbor violated your rights in a profound way. update to the story. And by the way, let me know in the comments if you enjoy these stories that have updates and are generally a little bit longer. Obviously, they are more exhausting to read, but in general, I like them more as well. So I posted a while back about my neighbor Bob blocking my driveway during a medical emergency where my wife nearly died from a pregnancy complication. So I got a lot of advice telling me to lawyer up and pursue both criminal and civil action, and I wanted to update everyone because the situation has developed in ways I never expected. First, thank you to everyone who gave me advice and support. Reading your comments while sitting in that hospital room gave me the strength to fight back instead of just accepting what happened. My wife and baby are now doing well. She is still on bed rest, but we are past the critical danger period and the doctors are cautiously optimistic. That is the most important thing. Now, for everything that happened with Bob, I followed the advice and contacted a personal injury attorney the day after my wife was released from the hospital, and the attorney I found specializes in cases involving personal injury and intentional misconduct. When I explained what happened, she immediately took the case. She said it was one of the most clearest cases of reckless endangerment and intentional infliction of emotional distress she had ever seen. We immediately filed a civil lawsuit against Bob for a substantial amount. The lawsuit included medical expenses, future medical expenses for the high-risk pregnancy, lost wages for both me and my wife, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages. My attorney was confident about the punitive damages because Bob's actions were so clearly intentional and malicious. But the civil suit was just the beginning. My attorney, who worked with the district attorney's office to pursue criminal charges, this is where things got really interesting. The DA initially was gonna charge Bob with reckless endangerment and obstruction of emergency services, which are both misdemeanors in our state, but serious ones that could carry jail time. My attorney pushed for more, arguing that Bob's intentional actions during a known medical emergency nearly resulted in death should constitute felony charges. The DA's office started really digging into Bob's background, and that is when everything came apart for him. Turns out Bob had done this before, not blocking a driveway during an emergency, but harassing neighbors to the point where they sold their homes and moved. The DA found 3 different families from his previous neighborhood who were willing to provide statements about Bob's pattern of harassment, property line disputes, and escalating behaviors. One family had actually filed complaints with police multiple times before giving up and then moving. More importantly, the DA discovered that Bob had been fired from his job as a property manager 2 years ago for falsifying inspection reports and habitability complaints to force tenants out. There was actually a whole investigation that had been done by the state housing authority, and Bob had systematically lied about code violations to create paper trails to evict tenants that he did not like. Several tenants had filed complaints, but nothing criminal came of it at the time. He just lost his property management license and his job. This established a pattern, though. Bob had a documented history of using false property claims and manufactured violations to harass and harm people. This went from being a one-time incident to showing a pattern of predatory behavior. The DA upgraded the charges. Bob was charged with felony reckless endangerment, felony obstruction of emergency services, and assault. And yes, assault, because the DA argued that Bob's actions constituted assault because he knowingly created a situation that caused physical harm to my wife and endangered my unborn child. The criminal case went to trial. Bob represented himself because, according to the courthouse gossip, he had gone through 3 different attorneys who all quit after he refused to consider any plea deals and insisted he had done nothing wrong. He actually argued in court that he had a right to block our driveway because we had been supposedly violating his property rights. He showed the judge photos of our car mirror allegedly over the property line by an inch. The prosecutor brought in the 911 recording as well. Hearing my panicked voice begging the dispatcher for help, describing my wife's condition, explaining that our neighbor would not move his truck, the courtroom was silent. You could hear Bob on the recording saying, "Not my problem," when I begged him to move the truck. The paramedics testified about the delay and how critical those minutes were. They explained that placental abruption is a time-critical emergency and that the obstruction directly impacted their response time. They testified that in their professional opinion, the delay could have been fatal. My wife testified too. She broke down describing the pain, the fear, feeling like she was dying while this man stood on his porch refusing to help. The jury was visibly affected. The DA brought in the families from Bob's previous neighborhood. They testified about his pattern of harassment. They testified about how he had made their lives hell over property disputes until they felt they had no choice but to move. The state housing investigator testified about Bob's history of falsifying property claims and using manufactured violations to harm people. Bob took the stand in his own defense. It was a disaster for him. He ranted about property rights and boundary lines and how people need to follow rules and apparently face consequences. And well, guys, he's not entirely wrong there. People certainly do need to face consequences for their actions, and in this case, the one that needs to face consequences is Bob himself. Touché. He actually said under oath that he had blocked the driveway intentionally to teach a lesson and that he didn't think it was really that serious because people exaggerate medical problems all the time. The prosecutor asked him directly, "So when the husband told you his pregnant wife was having a medical emergency, what did you do?" Bob answered, "I stayed where I was. He needed to learn that actions have consequences." What actions needed consequences? His parking violations. So you saw a pregnant woman in medical distress and you chose to prevent emergency access to teach her husband a lesson about parking? And Bob actually said yes. He said yes to that question. Well, guys, at least he's honest, stupid, and evil. In court, on the record, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts, the judge sentenced Bob to 4 years in prison. 4 years. And sorry, Dexter is touching the microphone, so if there are any weird noises, I apologize for that. I think even Dexter, my cat, was just absolutely shocked by this story. Anyway, the judge said during sentencing that Bob's complete lack of remorse and his pattern of using property disputes to harm others and his willingness to endanger a life over a parking dispute represented a profound disregard for human life and the safety of others. The judge noted that Bob had shown no understanding of the severity of his actions and posed a continued threat to his community. Bob stood there in shock. I think he genuinely believed that he'd be found not guilty because he had a right to park on the street. He started arguing with the judge about property law until the bailiff removed him from the courtroom. But wait, there's even more. So remember all those HOA violations he kept claiming we had? Well, all his complaints to code enforcement as well. My attorney subpoenaed all his communications with the HOA and with code enforcement. It turns out Bob had been filing false complaints not just against us, but against 6 other families in the neighborhood. He had been sending fake violation notices that looked like official HOA letters. He'd been calling code enforcement with made-up violations every week on different neighbors. The HOA was furious when they found out. They'd been getting complaints from homeowners about citations they never actually issued. Bob had been pretending to be the HOA president and sending official-looking letters with fake violations and threats of fines. So the HOA filed their own lawsuit against him for fraud, defamation, and impersonating HOA officials. Code enforcement was also pissed because they'd been investigating his false reports and wasting resources. They estimated he had filed over 150 false complaints in 8 months. They forwarded information to the DA about filing additional charges for making false reports to authorities, but the cherry on top? Bob's house went into foreclosure during all of this. Apparently, he had taken out a huge home equity loan to fund his legal defense after his attorneys quit, and between the legal foreclosure and the criminal fines and the impending civil judgment, Bob is financially ruined. Our civil case settled right before trial. Bob's homeowner insurance actually covered some of it because the incident technically occurred on the property, and we received a substantial settlement that covers all our medical expenses, my wife's lost wages during bed rest, future medical costs, and yes, punitive damages. I cannot discuss the exact amount due to the settlement terms, but it's enough that my wife won't have to return to work after the baby is born if she doesn't want to, and we have a college fund started for our child. Bob's house sold at auction. The family who bought it seems lovely. They came over and introduced themselves and apologized for everything their predecessor put us through. They asked about property lines and I showed them the survey. They said, "Looks good to us." And that was the end of it. Normal people. What a concept. Bob was so obsessed with rules, property rights, and consequences for violations, he spent months documenting every tiny perceived violation, measuring property lines to the inch, filing complaints, sending legal-sounding letters. In the end, every single rule he claimed to care about destroyed him. The property laws he tried to weaponize, well, the surveyor got proof that he was wrong and we had never violated anything. The HOA rules he kept citing, he was the one violating them by personating the HOA. The code enforcement he kept calling, well, they charged him for filing false reports. The consequences he kept threatening people with, he got them tenfold. He wanted everyone to follow rules and face consequences for violations, and he got exactly what he demanded. But he violated actual laws, not imaginary parking infractions, real laws about endangering people, filing false report, and fraud. And he faced the consequences. 4 years in prison, complete financial ruin, and a criminal record. Lost his house, and all because he insisted that rules matter and violations must be punished. He followed his own philosophy right into a prison cell. And the next one is a more light-hearted, malicious compliance story that is titled "No More Drugs in the Workplace?" Okay then. So my pet peeve is poorly written policy. If you're gonna go to the effort of writing the rules, you may as well do it properly and not get the intern to do it. My wife came home one day and showed a printout of her company's new workplace fitness for work policy that had been sent to all employees to sign and return. My wife, being my wife, decided to run it past me before she signed because I am, well, me. It was mostly an amateurish document that was absolutely ultimately a waste of ink and trees, but it did have a little bit to say about drugs in the workplace, which was essentially don't come to the work under the influence of drugs or alcohol and don't bring drugs or alcohol to work. I told her not to sign until they at the very least defined what drugs were. Were they including Tylenol, antibiotics, Ritalin? Or just the legal ones and recreational pharmaceuticals. Fast forward a couple days, version 2 of the document is presented. They fleshed out the drugs policy a little bit, basically using the dictionary definition, something along the lines of a non-prescription substance which has a physiological or a mood-altering effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body. Okay, then, time for the malicious compliance. She signed and presented it to HR the next day and went about her work. During the morning, there were increasing amounts of confusion and frustrated loud voices in the office. Apparently, it only took an hour before zero work was being done, and there was a crowd of workers around the break room. The manager eventually zeroed in on my wife, apparently the only one who was not looking confused, and asked if she had anything to do with stealing all the coffee in the break room. She admitted it was her and pointed out the new fitness for work policy, which prohibited the consumption of mood-altering substances in the workplace. He tried to argue that it was just coffee, but she pointed out that it was definitely a mood-altering substance as per company policy, and as such was not allowed to be on the premises without a prescription. And well, she had made her point. She retrieved her coffee she had stashed in the storeroom, the office mood was altered, and the company actually commissioned a functional fitness for work policy based upon the published government guidelines. And the next one is a brand new, satisfying petty revenge story. It is titled "Relatives Getting Gifts They Asked For, But Not Happy." So I always try to find the best gifts for my family, no matter how much they cost. But at some point, some of my relatives started talking how gifts are not important and how it is all about family unity and attention and blah blah blah. And they announced they were not gonna gift anything more than $5 and encouraged others to do so as well. It was not about the money, they earned well, it was about them not wanting to spend money for others. So they gifted cheap things while receiving good gifts. Okay then, next Christmas I carefully selected useless crap under $5 specifically for them. Other family got their good gifts as usual, and I also said, as you asked, your gifts are under $5 but still very useful. And I told a BS story how lucky they are with these things and how they can use them, because these cheap things needed explanations how to use them, and you had to see the faces of these entitled crooks. Since then they stopped talking about $5 gifts.